Welcome everyone to our webinar titled Exploring Children's Falls Using the Electronic Canadian Hospitals Injury Reporting and Prevention Program, also known as eCHIRPP, facilitated by the Fall Prevention Community of Practice. My name is Shamiza Allard and I am the Knowledge Coordinator at the Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation, also known as ONF. ONF sponsors the Fall Prevention Community of Practice Loop and Loop Junior, along with the annual Fall Prevention Month campaign. So before we begin, I'd like to give you a quick rundown of the Zoom meeting platform. Your screen may look a little bit different than what you're seeing right now, but for the most part, you should have all these features. So if your Zoom application is open in full screen, you can double click or press the escape button on your keyboard to exit full screen. There should also be a button on the top right corner of your screen that says exit full screen. On this slide, you can see that I've circled in red where the exit full screen button can be found. The webinar technology consists of two parts, audio and visual. Both audio and visuals are provided through your computer, monitor, and speakers. To test or adjust your audio settings, look for the audio settings or join audio button at the bottom left of your screen. This will provide options for testing your computer microphone and speakers. If you have questions about the technology at any time, please feel free to send me an email at shamiza.allard@onf.org, or you can type them into the chat box. My colleague Marguerite and I will be monitoring this. But just some additional features. So if you look to the bottom of your screen, you will see buttons that allow you to access the chat box, raise hands, and Q&A features on Zoom. The chat box allows you to send messages to webinar presenters and other webinar participants. You can use the raise hand button if you want to reach out to me through the chat box, or you can submit questions through the Q&A box. So you will only be able to view questions you have asked, not questions posed by others when you use the Q&A box feature. So to simplify things a little bit, for technical questions, please use the chat box. And for topic-related questions, please use the Q&A box. And if you need to leave the webinar at any time, click the red Leave Meeting button at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. So the webinar is being recorded and a YouTube link will be sent to all participants in about 1 week along with the presentation slides. So I would like to now introduce our presenters, Sulaf Elkhalifa and Stephen McFaull. Sulaf is a recent graduate of the University of Ottawa's Master of Epidemiology program. She has been working with the Injury Surveillance team at the Public Health Agency of Canada for approximately 1 year, focusing primarily on childhood falls. Stephen has been with the CHIRPP/eCHIRPP program for about 20 years. He is currently an epidemiologist and team lead for the Unintentional Injury Surveillance Center for Surveillance and Applied Research at the Public Health Agency of Canada. His background is in biomechanics and statistics. So without further ado, please take it away, Stephen and Sulaf. You may now share your screen.
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us in this webinar related to childhood falls. I'll be getting us started with some introductory comments, an overview of the project, and a description of the data source. And Sulaf will present the rest of the study. This is just an overview of the topics we'll be discussing in this webinar. After reviewing the data source and the methodology, we will look at how falls compare to other external causes of injury. After that, we will focus on falls and the mechanisms by age group. Along the way, we will also put a spotlight on some specific mechanisms, such as falls from or with caregivers, falls from trees, trampolines, and grocery carts. So I'll start off just by showing this slide. This is taken from a forthcoming report on traumatic brain injuries and other head injuries across the life course. We know the seriousness of the issue of seniors' falls and the sharply increasing rates from age 65 years and onward. But as you can see in this slide, falls are also an issue at the other end of the age spectrum among children under 10 years of age. So while seniors' falls are more uniform in terms of the circumstances, many of them are level falls, children's falls are more varied, as you will see throughout this presentation. So globally, falls are the leading external cause of injuries requiring visits to emergency departments and the primary cause of hospitalization among children. In Canada, falls account for nearly half of all Canadian hospitalizations and 4% of unintentional deaths among children. In the US, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reports that 31% of non-fatal pediatric injuries are fall-related, amounting to an estimated annual 2.8 million ER visits. The burden of fall injuries is unequally distributed in both the international and national levels. High-income countries have lower incidence of fall-related injuries and death. Children of low socioeconomic households are at greater risk of fall-related injuries. So the purpose of this study was to provide the latest sentinel surveillance statistics regarding childhood falls, to delve deeper into the context surrounding falls, ultimately to help inform prevention and mitigation efforts, as well as identifying vulnerable groups and areas of high frequency or severity. So just a little explanation of the data source. The CHIRPP program was launched in 1990 in the pediatric hospitals across Canada. It was expanded after that to add some general hospitals. Currently, it's operating in 11 pediatric and 8 general hospitals, and it operates as a sentinel surveillance system. The ultimate goal is to contribute to a reduction in the number and severity of injuries in Canada. The main method to capture useful injury prevention information are the narrative fields. So as you can see, we have sites across Canada. This is as of June 16th. We're actually adding more as we speak. We're just doing some negotiations with various other sites to add more general hospitals. So the CHIRPP system contains over 3 million records currently. A number of injury prevention initiatives have been supported by CHIRPP, including related to baby walkers, playground equipment, body checking, and minor hockey. This busy infographic shows some of the milestones in the history of the CHIRPP program. Just pointing your attention, though, to around 2010, 2011, where we modernized the system to its current form, which we call eCHIRPP. So eCHIRPP is a web-based dynamic system built by SINFI, which is a Canadian network for public health intelligence. It facilitates increasing the timeliness of data so that we can report near real time. And it also allows the easy implementation of early warning rules. This is just a shot of the eCHIRPP dashboard. It allows us to track data entry from each site. And we can also do customized searches and analyses. So before I leave this to Sulaf to finish, this is just a table of some of the variables that are available within the CHIRPP system. There are over 60 of them, but these are just some that we use fairly frequently. I'll turn your attention to the 2 main variables, though, which we have highlighted for this study and used a lot in the analysis, was the external cause and the narrative, or what happened. The patient will indicate what happened. The patient or the caregiver will indicate what happened during the fall event. So I will now hand this presentation off to Sulaf, and this is the bulk of a big project that she's been working on for the past year. Sulaf.
Hello, everyone. So I will begin by going over the methods that I used to acquire all the results that you'll see. So The data set that I used consisted of injuries presented to emergency departments across 19 Canadian hospitals between the years of 2011 through 2017. So any injury where the patient was reported to be above 9 years of age was excluded, and this left us with approximately 300,000 injuries. As you see further on, we use this data set to compare the profiles of falls versus non-fall injuries. From the data set of 300,000 injuries, we selected for cases that were explicitly coded as falls, and this left us with approximately 181,227 fall-related injuries, and that we used to generate fall profiles by the different age groups. In our report, we also wanted to delve a little deeper into the mechanism through which these falls took place. So what we ended up doing was taking a 1% sample of the full data set and manually coding it based on the injury description, text descriptions that we saw in the previous slides. By manually coding each individual fall injury record, we were able to establish coding rules, and we used these rules to design a program that would automatically assign fall-specific mechanisms to the fall data set we created earlier. So in the end, we were able to automatically code for 128,406 injury cases that we used to analyze by mechanism. And we found that we were unable to analyze for a little over 50,000 cases for various reasons that I've listed up on the slides. So how did we assign these fall mechanisms? So the process of auto-coding the fall mechanisms for each injury case was an iterative process that we undertook on size 9.4. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the auto-coding process, since it would require delving into a lot of SAS talk, but it simply involved creating a program that mined through the injuries descriptions of each record and matched it to a predetermined list of fall mechanisms. So we began the process by compiling a list of keywords, phrases, and variable codes that were common across the different injury cases, and this step was done using the 1% sample that we already manually coded. We then used these commonalities to develop a program capable of independently identifying the relevant cases for each mechanism. After creating this program, we ran it through the entire data set, and we inspected a large sample of the auto-selected cases and refined our program based on the results. So for example, this included adding or removing additional conditions to exclude non-relevant cases and to include cases that were not originally picked up. We repeated this refinement step multiple times until a large random sample of the output was correctly coded. In the last step, we compared the frequency of each mechanism to those of the manually coded random sample to elucidate whether the overall accuracy of our auto-coding strategy was appropriate. In the end, we were able to code for 28 mechanisms. I put up the inclusion and exclusion criteria for all of those mechanisms that we coded, just for your interest. I'm not going to go over them, but you can look through them, and if you have any questions, let us know. So there's a couple of coded. But moving on to the real results, we'll start by first comparing falls versus other mechanisms. So a comparison of the fall injuries to the non-falls did reveal some similarities and marked differences. We see that both groups of injuries were disproportionately located among the cases that were coded as non-falls, we found that almost half of the injuries were caused by being struck by or against objects. Over here in the slide, sorry, I'm getting a little messed up. And the remaining cases were caused by cuts, piercings, poisoning, transport-related, and other unintentional means. As you can see. So a comparison of the fall injuries to the non-falls did reveal some similarities and differences. We can see that both groups of injuries were disproportionately located in the home of the patient, But we also see that the proportion of injuries on roads is much higher among non-falls, whereas the proportion of falls in public parks is much higher among falls. Of the known cases, we can see some distinct differences. Of the known areas, we can see some distinct differences. Although the living room was found to be the most common area in both falls and non-falls, falls are much more likely in the bedroom, in the sidewalk, and the playgrounds, which makes a lot of sense. And we also see that non-fall injuries occurred in greater proportions in the kitchen, in greater proportions in roadways and kitchens over here. And this makes a lot of sense if you realize that the kitchen is where the pointy objects are, and where roadways are where car accidents tend to occur. Moving on, you can also notice that the degree of missing data and unknowns was much greater among non-fall injuries and falls, and this pattern does persist across the other variables that we analyzed in our report, which we certainly found interesting. Here we've labeled some of the top injured body parts in both falls and non-fall groups. Regardless of the cause of injury, the head and the face had the highest proportion of injuries, as you can see, although the head, face, wrists, and ankles occupied greater proportions of fall injuries, while among non-falls, the abdominal, fingers, and hands occupied higher proportions. So in regards to injury diagnosis, for the primary diagnosis, we found that the open wounds occurred at the highest frequency among non-falls over here, but traumatic brain injuries were the most common injury diagnosed among falls, right over there. By virtue of their natures, there were some injury diagnoses that were unique to non-falls, such as foreign bodies in the body and pulled elbows over here. Also notice how where sprains or strains were much more likely among falls. But I also want to bring your attention to how non-falls had a higher proportion of non-detectable injuries. But despite this, the severity which we measured using percent hospitalization as a proxy was similar between the two groups, hovering around 4%. Moving on to falls, and leaving other types of injuries behind, we'll begin by introducing the a tile chart, and we'll look into the different mechanisms that we auto-coded in its relation to percent admittance. So the tile graph illustrates the proportion of fall-related injuries by mechanism. The large tiles indicated by the bolded red lines enclose a group of mechanisms by an overarching category, such as furniture in this instance, and you can see recreational activities over here, while the smaller tiles within them represent the specific mechanisms, in this case beds, but above it we can see sofas and chairs. So the size of each tile is proportional to its overall frequency, so we can see that smaller tiles are less frequent than larger tiles. And over here we have the percent of admitted cases. So the color gradient is proportional to this percent. The lighter colors indicate low percent admission, and the darker colors correspond to high percent admission. As I mentioned earlier, we use percent admission as a way of gauging the severity of the injury cases. Mechanisms with a larger proportion of admitted cases are therefore considered more severe than their lighter counterparts. So this is a tile graph for children 0 to 9 years of age, and it tells us that the leading mechanism of fall-related injuries are same-level falls, falls from playground equipment, and stair falls. We can see that same-level falls are generally associated with relatively minor injuries, as indicated by their light color, while window falls are much more severe. And window falls are the really dark blue tile. The same goes for balcony falls, which is directly above it. And this demonstrates an intuitive pattern that we hold, that the greater the height from which the fall took place, the more severe the resulting injury tends to be. Of course, there are other factors that must be taken into account, such as the surface that the child falls onto and the angle of the fall, as well as the age of the child, but we'll revisit these factors later on. Fortunately, we found that over 60% of patients who did refer to the emergency departments for fall-related injuries were treated in the ED, and 30% were only given advice or placed under observation. Falls are the leading cause of traumatic brain injuries, or TBI for short, among children. So because of this, we were very interested in looking at their distribution across the different mechanisms. Traumatic brain injuries, as their name suggests, consist of a number of cerebral and cranial injuries, all of which impair the normal functioning, the normal functioning of the brain. Symptoms are highly varied and severity tends to be as well. So in this tile graph, the red color gradient corresponds to the proportion of traumatic brain injury in each mechanism. A quick skim of the graph, we can already pick out some distinct patterns. We see a high level of TBIs among nursery equipment over here, as well as drops by caregivers, which we can see over here. There's low amounts among playground equipment and moderate amounts among furniture falls. And we'll see later on in this presentation that TBIs are not only a product of the fall mechanism, but as well as a reflective of the mean age within these mechanisms. Regardless, mechanisms with a high proportion of TBIs were grocery carts, changing tables, and baby seats, as you can see by the dark red colors. So moving on to the age groups, we can see we'll restrict our focus now to infants, which we define as children between the age of 0 to 11 months of age. So in this stage of life, children undergo a remarkable growth period unrivaled by any other period in our lives. Granted, many of us can't remember our times as infants, but we generally see them crawling around, and we have developed a general sense of how they behave. We know that infants are unique in that they are mostly immobile and completely dependent on their caregivers for survival. As a consequence, infants require continuous supervision to ensure their safety. And before we go on, I do want to ask a question. How many of us here have children between 0 to 11 months of age in our households? You can put the question up. I'll give you about 10 seconds to vote. So let's see. Oh, not a lot of infants in the household, but we've got a couple. So for those of us who do have infants in the household, these next couple of slides will be very informative. So keep your ears perked. So when looking at the location of falls, we found that for infants, the home dominates, accounting for almost 80% of cases. More specifically, infants fall primarily in the bedroom. This is unsurprising for anyone who has ever had to mind a baby, as they are very prone to rolling off the bed. Infants, unlike adults, have relatively large heads in proportion to their small bodies. Because of that, their center of gravity is skewed, making them much more likely to fall on their heads than anywhere else. And unfortunately, this is especially damaging as their skulls have yet to fully develop at this stage. Incidentally, traumatic brain injuries are the most common injury diagnosis for this age group, as you can see over here. While the head and face are the leading injury locations, which I've labeled over here. Unsurprisingly, we found that males have a higher proportion of fall-related injuries than their female counterparts. This pattern isn't restricted to just infants, but is observed across the different age ranges. I say unsurprisingly because the male's penchant for injuring themselves has been well documented in the literature. The reasons as to why is not especially clear, but there is some evidence of socialization coupled with certain biological factors that renders boys more attracted to risk-taking, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. Looking at the infant-specific tile chart, we can see some very high levels of TBIs. Overall, infants are prone to traumatic injuries because of their high head-to-body ratio, as we mentioned before, and their underdeveloped cranial bones. And this point is illustrated very well by this graph. With increasing age, the degree of TBI decreases dramatically. You can see. And again, males have a higher frequency of TBIs than females because they're more injured more often. The tile graph of the percent admitted for infants is a little more forgiving. We see that despite the high frequency of TBIs we observed in the preceding graph, fall-related injuries among infants tend to be relatively minor. The leading mechanism for this age were falls from beds, falls off sofas, and same level falls. As we'll see, infants are the only age group in our data set where same level falls did not occupy the largest proportion of falls, which considering their own immobility doesn't really come as a surprise. But I want to leave infants behind for a little while, and I want to delve deeper into the mechanism over here, which is falls with or from caregivers. I also want to quickly note that the next couple of slides are going to be for all age groups, not just infants. So in the early years of life, children are largely immobile, and this is beneficial in that it makes it a lot easier to keep an eye on them without having to chase them around. But it also means the parents and caregivers are largely responsible for moving them from one location to another. And one of the biggest fears running through both old and new parents is that when they look down at their babies in their arms is the fear of dropping them. So among all age groups, falls with or from caregivers represent approximately 4% of our data set, but for infants, it's about 16%. In 46% of the cases, the caregiver said that they dropped the child directly, while in 41% of instances, the caregiver falls while holding the child in their arms. There's a small minority of cases where the child falls from the caregiver, such as falling from a piggyback ride or from the laps of parents. So when compared to the average percent admittance, which is approximately 4%, injuries resulting from falls with or from or with caregivers are frequently more serious. In fact, this mechanism has a percent admittance that is twice that of the average, so about 8%. And other studies have documented similar results. One study in Sydney, Australia found that jobs from or with caregivers was the leading cause of injury, was the third leading cause of injury and the first leading cause of hospitalization among infants. Another study by Burrows et al. Reports that falls from a parent's arms has the greatest proportion of abnormal CT scans. And why do these types of falls tend to be more serious than other types of falls? It may be because caregivers will carry their children at higher heights than other surfaces. It might also be because when dropped, children are done so at an unusual angle, which results in more serious injuries, as well that caregivers who fall with their children in their arms are also at risk of crushing them with their own weight. And this can get especially worse when stairs are involved. At least a quarter of falls from or with caregivers in our own data set took place in stairs. So this illustration is from an article by Pinnock, who found that most caregivers who fell with children on the stairs were holding them around their abdominal area. This creates an obstruction to the caregiver's sights and that leads them to miss a step. The authors suggest to hold the child to the side with one arm when using the handrail on the opposite and using the handrail on the opposite side to guide their own movement down. Doing this will provide an unobstructed view of the staircase. So other suggestions include using skid-free surfaces in areas of high traffic, making sure to remove objects that can trip or slip you, and wearing non-slip footwear. Many adults can also become bogged down with trying to fall-proof the home for their infants, but forget to do the same for themselves. So it's important to keep your own safety in mind at all times. I also want to quickly note that the prevention tips that I provide in this slide are not necessarily reflective of fact, but they are from very reputable sources. So as the years accumulate and children grow older, much to the dismay of their parents, their mobility increases. However, the surge in the frequency of falls among this age group tells us that try as they might, the toddlers haven't mastered walking or running on 2 feet. In fact, children aged 1 followed by children aged 2 have the highest frequency of falls among the different age groups in our data set and the highest frequency of same level falls overall. Like infants, the patient's home continues to be the leading location of injury. However, unlike infants, we found that most injuries occur in the living room rather than the bedroom. Toddlers are still mostly heads proportion-wise, and so the head and face continues to dominate. But at this stage, we begin to see open wounds becoming more common than traumatic brain injuries. You can see over here. The leading mechanism for toddlers varies slightly from infants. Instead of bed, sofas, and same level falls, as it was for infants, it is same level falls, stairs, and beds. With regards to severity, we can see that the majority of injuries are fairly minor, as noted by their pale color, but with most injuries being treated on site, there are obvious exceptions such as window falls over here and falls off balconies right below it. So with the increase in age, we also see an overall decrease in the frequency of TBIs among toddlers. The TBIs that are present within this age group appear to be concentrated around specific mechanisms, with the greatest offenders being grocery carts, which is this really dark color over here, as well as infant equipment, as you can see in this large tile. So for the next couple of slides, I do want to focus on grocery carts because it does tend to be very significant source of injuries. So grocery carts are a fairly innocuous feature of everyday life, and we don't spare much thought into it. But if we look at the existing data, grocery carts do represent a significant hazard to children. So before going on, I do want to ask what everyone's opinion on regarding putting children on grocery carts. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to answer that. All right, let's see the results. Oh, most people appear to be in support of placing children on grocery carts. So, but looking at the existing data, and this is a figure from a study using data from the National Electronic Injury Surveillance System in the US. Across the x-axis are the years that the study was under observation. Across the y-axis is the rate of injury per 10,000 children. And this graph is for children who are younger than 15 years of age. Looking at the specific graph for children between the ages of 0 to 4 years of age, we notice a positive slope. The authors noted an annual increase of approximately 56.8% in the rate of shopping cart falls. In our own data, we can see that the number of grocery cart falls peaks at around age of 2. And contrary to the general trends of falls, there is a higher frequency of falls among females in this age group than males, but overall, collectively, the males do have a greater number of grocery falls than females. Over 50% of children said that they were sitting, standing, or being carried at the time of the fall. Interestingly enough, a similar study on shopping cart-related injuries reported that the risk of falls among children from shopping carts increased significantly when the child was standing, while sitting within the cart was associated with cart tip-offs. In our own study, we did group cart tip-offs with children's falls, but it's interesting nonetheless. Looking at the resulting injuries, we can see that the vast majorities are located in the head. Incidentally, 70% of injuries were traumatic brain injuries. So 3% of all grocery cart fall injuries were severe enough to warrant hospitalization. Evidently, grocery carts, despite making our shopping experiences much easier, can be very dangerous when children are involved. In order to minimize the risk of injury, the best thing a parent can do is to not place their children on a cart, try online shopping, or bringing along a partner to help carry your child, as the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends. But if it's unavoidable, always use the designated seatbelt and never allow children to sit in the basket or to hang outside of it. It's also recommended to stay close to the cart. One study found that parents who wander away from the cart to a distance of 10 feet or more are more likely to have their children attempt to climb out of the cart, and this increases the risk of falls. So at 3 to 4 years of age, we begin to notice that children have generally mastered the art of walking and running. Unfortunately, this does make it more difficult to catch and supervise them. Fortunately, 3 to 4 years of age is when we can begin herding them into preschools and other childcare services, but increased attendance to preschools also means that children begin having regular access to playgrounds. Because of this access, we begin to see the proportion of falls on playgrounds begin to catch up to the proportion of falls in the bedroom over here. Although falls in the living room and the patient's own home continue to be the dominant site area and location of injuries, respectively. The head and the face continue to be the primary site of injury, although at this age you begin to notice that their body proportions are normalizing and that they're using their limbs more often to catch their falls. As a consequence, fractures become more common than traumatic brain injuries, but open wounds still dominate. The top 3 mechanisms for this age group are same level falls, falls from playground equipment, and falls downstairs. Very few children are falling off furniture, as you can see at this point, but they're more often to venture out into the playgrounds. Regardless, the overall percent admitted matches that of the average at around 4%, whereas 68% of children were treated in the emergency departments. Because they are learning to break their falls with their limbs and their proportions are becoming more normalized, we're not seeing such a high degree of TBIs as with the younger age groups, with the exception being grocery carts. Although in the next couple of slides, I do want to focus on this little box over here, and that's falls off trees. So tree climbing is a childhood activity that I'm sure we all have fond memories of. It's a form of risk play that has the potential to improve our cognitive and physical skills. So I'm going to ask another question. I do want to know what opinions everyone holds on tree climbing. So do you believe that children should be encouraged, allowed, or prohibited from climbing trees? So I will give you a couple of seconds to answer that. Okay. Interesting. So most people seem to allow their children, but not actively encourage or discourage them from climbing, which kind of matches what a survey of American parents that was conducted recently. So a large proportion of parents were found to approve of tree climbing among their children, believing it to influence the self-confidence, the dexterity, strength, risk management, and spatial intelligence of children. However, there is evidence that tree climbing recreationally is declining, at least in high-income countries. In England, a 36% decline in the number of tree fall injuries from 1999 to 2007 has been observed in emergency departments across the country, while a similar study found that 1 in 3 children said that they never climbed a tree in their lives. In our own data set, we found that there were 762 recorded injuries resulting from tree falls in our data set. As you can see, the number of falls increases steadily with age, with a bit of a rough patch around 7 to 8 years of age. Again, males are disproportionately represented within this mechanism. Children appear to be climbing trees most often at home and in public parks, as you can see over here. Not so much in school, but more specifically, they're climbing in gardens and yards in the home. Regardless of whether you are pro or anti-tree climbing, it's undeniable that falls from trees can have serious consequences. So 10% of all patients who fell from trees were admitted to the hospital, making falls from trees the third most severe mechanism in our data set after windows over here and balcony falls. If we zoom into the graph, we can see that the majority of injuries that did require hospitalization were fractures, with the remaining being comprised of intracranial injuries, open wounds, and internal injuries. Fractures also comprise the greatest proportion of non-admitted injuries. However, we see a greater variability in diagnosis over here. Regardless of admittance, injuries were frequently concentrated among the upper extremities, with the forearm boosting the the largest proportion, followed by the elbow over here, and the wrist and the head. So to minimize the incidence of tree falls, parents report that they utilize a series of rules and restrictions. For instance, children are advised to avoid climbing trees that they would naturally require assistance to reach. Trees that have weak branches that are wet or slippery or that are excessively small are frequently forbidden from being climbed. So moving on to children who are 5 to 6 years of age, and this tends to mark a transition point for children. So at this age, they're attending school more regularly. Bikes, scooters, and other recreational equipment begin to emerge, giving them access to speeds that they aren't necessarily equipped to handle. Despite their growing bodies, their cognitive abilities are still very much limited. The frontal cortex has yet to fully develop, and impulse control and ability to recognize and appreciate dangers is at an early stage for children. Incidentally, we do see the percent of admittance peak at this age, reaching a high of 5.5%. Nevertheless, the vast majority of injuries are still treated in the emergency departments. The home remains a leading location of injury, with school being a close second. However, we do see the playgrounds overtake the living room as the most frequent area of injury. The head and the face continue to be the most common injury locations on the body, but rather than open wounds, fractures become the most common injury location, the most common injury diagnosis, excuse me. So the leading mechanisms among this age group are still same level falls, falls from playgrounds, and falls downstairs. TBI's levels are relatively low among this age group, although falls from grocery carts and nursery equipment still pose significant risks. The percent admittance remains relatively unchanged across the various mechanisms. Notably, among this age group, falls from windows, strollers, and trees do have the highest proportion of admitted cases. But for the next couple of slides, I do want to focus on trampolines over here. So for me, trampolines tend to be a sore topic. Growing up, my parents absolutely refused to get me and my sister a trampoline, no matter how much we begged. It was a decision I couldn't understand when I was younger. They were fun and exciting, and what could possibly go wrong with trampolines? And I do want to know if you've ever had or currently do have a trampoline in your own home. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to answer that. No, oh, that's good to hear. For the people who do have some trampolines, you might be interested in some articles. So these are some news articles that I picked out from online newspapers. As you can see, so trampolines can be very dangerous, but even knowing the dangers that trampolines pose, previous eCHIRPP data has revealed that the number of trampoline-related injuries continue to increase. Many have speculated that the increase in trampoline-related injuries presented to emergency departments across not only Canada but internationally may be a consequence of the increase in popularity of trampoline parks. Regardless, according to our own data, we found that the vast majority of injuries are still incurred at the home over here, followed by other houses, and more specifically in the garden and yard. Predictably, injuries were concentrated among the extremities, with nearly equal proportion of injuries affecting the ankles, elbows, and lower legs of patients. Half of these injuries were fractures, and the remaining injuries were either sprains or strains or soft tissue injuries. One interesting thing we did notice about trampoline fall-related injuries is that, in contrast to the general trend, there is a higher number of trampoline falls among females and males within the older age group. We can see that at 4 years of age is when the frequency between males and females begins to significantly diverge. Also note that children aged 5 and 6 have the highest frequency of trampoline falls than all other age groups. So how can we prevent our children from falling off trampolines? The American Academy of Pediatrics, the Canadian Society of Pediatrics, and the Canadian Academy of Sports all advise against recreational trampoline use. Health Canada takes a more moderate approach and advises against trampolines for children under the age of 6. In the meantime, you can reduce the risk of injury by limiting the number of jumpers to only 1 at a time, placing trampolines on even, low surfaces, using netted, soft-edge trampolines, supervising children, prohibiting flips, somersaults, and other tricks on the trampolines, as the latter have been associated with neurological injuries. If you are unable to get rid of your trampoline. So the oldest age group in our data set are spending a lot less time at home and more at school. However, it's important to remember that even though they may appear to be older and wiser than their younger counterparts, they're still cognitively underdeveloped compared to adults. It is in the 7 to 9 age group that we see for the first time school rather than the home as the most common location of injury. And the largest proportion took place in the playground, followed by the garden or yard. The head is still the most common injured body part, followed by the forearm rather than the face. And fractures are by far the most frequent injury type presented to the emergency departments. The oldest age group also boasts the lowest frequency of fall-related injuries, both admitted and non-admitted. But looking at their tile charts, you can see that the leading mechanism of injury among this age group are falls remains unchanged through the previous age group, although falls from playground does drop by a small margin relative to children aged 5 to 6 years of age. So, however, because injuries often affect the upper extremities more often, the percent of traumatic brain injuries is relatively lower. Among 7 to 9 years of age, falls from baby seats are associated with the highest percentage of traumatic brain injuries. But in the next couple of slides, I do want to focus on playground equipment, since it's such a significant topic when it comes to childhood falls. So playgrounds are both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, they represent a source of joy and fun where children can exercise and develop their physical, cognitive, and social skills. On the other hand, they have been and can be a source of serious and severe childhood injuries. Finding the right balance between safety and fun is a bit challenging, but it can be done. So playground-related falls account for a significant proportion of fall injuries, approximately 11%, in fact. So the frequency of these types of falls generally increase steadily with age, peaks around 5 to 6 years of age, and declines thereafter. In our own data, playground-related falls are much more likely at school, even more so in public parks, and less so in the home. When compared to other types of falls, playground falls involve the upper extremities more often than general falls, and less so the head and face area. They also have a higher proportion of fractures and a lower proportion of TBIs and open wounds. As you can see through this graph, that playground falls are much more serious than other types of falls, as they're more likely to require hospitalization. And these are some articles that I picked up from recent news articles, just to underline the seriousness of playground-related injuries. If we look at the primary factor code associated with playground-related falls, fall injuries, we can see that falls related to monkey bars increase with age and peak around 6 years of age, whereas falls associated with slides tend to decrease with age. Over here. And then you can also see some interesting pattern with the other factor codes. So there are several steps that can be taken to reduce the incidence of not only falls, but other forms of injuries in playgrounds. So the Canadian Pediatric Society recommends lowering the height of playground equipment, as several studies have found that at 1.5 meters and above, the risk of falls increases dramatically among children. So it's also important to ensure that the equipment is age appropriate. And the Canadian Standards Association, the United States Consumer Product Safety Commission, and the ASTM International have all released equivalent documents pertaining to playground safety. But parents and teachers alike can also minimize the risk by actively supervising children, inspecting the equipment regularly for hazards and damages, as well as ensuring the equipment isn't overcrowded. Speaking with children about the risks and dangers associated with the playground equipment can also help reduce the incidence of playground falls and other injuries. So falls, as we've seen, are not black and white. Their mechanism is diverse and the resulting injuries are as well. However, one thing they do have in common is that they are all preventable. Recognition and appreciation of the fall risks that children are exposed to on a regular basis is an important preliminary step in alleviating some of this risk. With children, it is important to correct for any hazards that may be present in the home and to maintain constant supervision, particularly among infants. Parents should remember that the cognitive and physical limitations that children face at this particular age, so keep that always in mind. And infants are particularly vulnerable to falls from furniture, especially beds and sofas, while children age 1 and 2 are prone to falls downstairs. Among the older age groups, falls from playground equipment present serious concerns. But among all age groups, it's important to be vigilant of the surrounding environment. I've also provided a color-coded overview of the different age groups that we went through. There is sex, location, area, contacts. So you can go through that at your own leisure. And then there are the references So that is the presentation. Thank you for tuning in. I will answer any questions that are present.
Okay, thank you so much for that really, really informative presentation, both you and Sulaf and Stephen. So as Sulaf mentioned, she is open. They're both open for some questions right now. And we have about 3 in the chat box. So Sulaf, did you want to maybe go ahead and read those 3 out loud? And if anybody has any more, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box. We have about 5 minutes left. We don't get to all. Rest assured, Sulaf and Stephen will still answer them at a later time. And then I'll post it on Luke Jr. So take it away, Sulaf.
Okay. Did you say the questions were in the chat box or in the Q&A?
In the Q&A. In the Q&A.
Okay.
Let me know if you need any support. I can help you through that.
Okay. So the no participating hospitals in Ontario, I will let Steve answer that.
Yes, the CHIRPP system has 5. Currently, there are 5. There's another one on board in negotiations to get them on board, but there are 5 hospitals from Ontario.
Okay. So the second question is, were there any deaths as well due to falls in children, or was it out of scope? So eCHIRPP doesn't really capture death as well as we would hope it does, because oftentimes children's deaths occurs before they arrive at in the emergency department, so we aren't able to capture that. And they might also die a couple of days after the emergency department visits, and so we missed that. But we did find a small number of deaths, but not significant enough to really show up in the data. So, so the last question is, did you look at injuries due to monkey bars? We didn't look at injuries specifically due to monkey bars. We mostly did broadly playground-related injuries, but it is something that we're interested in, and we might look into it in the future. Is there anything you'd like to add, Steve?
I'm just looking at the next question. I think I can answer. The data is very detailed. What do you expect the proportion or ratio to be of cases caught by CHIRPP versus non-CHIRPP hospitals? This is something that question we get fairly often. So CHIRPP is a sentinel system. It wasn't meant to be population-based in the sense of counting all cases and knowing the burden. What we focus on more is from the narratives of the specific circumstances. It's more representative of the circumstances than the number of people being injured. But we are doing some testing of trying to estimate the level of coverage that CHIRPP has compared to the rest of hospitals. Mostly right now we're just focusing on a study with the Ontario hospitals, and that will vary depending on the severity of the injury.
So the next question is, with the rise and promotion of risky play, do you think fall data will be impacted? That's a difficult question. Hard to predict. I really don't have, do I think it might, with the more risk you take, more likely you are to fall, but do you have a prediction, Steve?
No, it's the same. I mean, we'll continue to surveil and do some time trending, and if anything pops out in terms of a signal that indicates that the rates are going up more than historically, we might dig into it deeper, but we still wouldn't be able to say for sure it was from that, but it is a good question.
So the next question is, what program was used to generate the proportion graphics that include the location and areas? So all graphics in this presentation were done on SAS 9.4. If you'd like to know the codes for that, I'd be happy to send it to anyone who's willing. I do have macros for those. And the last question is, how do you feel about the idea that falls can be prevented later in life by increasing physical literacy earlier in life? How do you recommend to prevent falls early in life? Interact with possible reduced physical literacy. I'm not too sure. I will take a moment to think about that, but I will pass it on to Steve.
Yeah, I mean, that's an issue that's come up for us. We work in a group here where we have an injury group, injury surveillance group. We also have another group that's within our overall center that looks at the promotion of physical activity. So there's always that trade-off between physical activity, and I mean, I think that comes up with the tree climbing aspect too, is to promote children to be more active, for not only to allow them to get better skilled at reducing falls, but also just for general health and prevention of obesity. But it is something that comes up. We tend to look more at the surveillance of injuries at this point in time, but it's definitely something that we've talked about with our other group.
Okay. I did see one fleeting question about publishing the data or if it's going to be available. The PowerPoint will be available alongside the link to the YouTube video, and we are in the process of working to make this the data that we went over available to the public.
Okay, so sorry, no, continue, and then I'll wrap up.
I was just going to say it doesn't appear there are any more questions, but go ahead.
Yeah, so we are a little over time, so thanks everyone who stuck around. We really appreciate that. So again, thank you for all of your participation and for joining us and engaging in this really great discussion. So for more information about the fall prevention community of practice, please visit Loop Junior at junior.fallsloop.com. And once again, November is Fall Prevention Month. We're just in the final stretch of things. So visit our website for ideas and you can take action and promote fall prevention in your community at www.fallpreventionmonth.ca. So when the webinar has ended, you'll be redirected to Zoom and invited to participate in a very brief survey. So please click the continue button on your browser and you'll be redirected to Smartsheets for the survey. And we would appreciate any feedback that you can offer so we can continue to offer high quality webinars such as these in the future. So thank you all again and have a wonderful day. And don't forget to check back Loop Junior because the YouTube link and the slide deck will be posted. So until next time, thanks everyone. See you later.